Welcome back. Today what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about culture in the democratization process and universalism, that sort of thing. Everything that we talked about in the last class, including the conditions that give rise to democracy and the various regime types, can be linked and affected by political culture and perhaps other forms of culture. So the question that we ask today is, are certain cultures more compatible with democracy than others? And we'll start by building on last week's lessons about the state and regime types. Remember the definitions of democracy. Now we can build on the more mechanistic understanding of democracy that we talked about before, those Dahl's procedural minimums, by incorporating people into the equation. After all, democracy means literally power to the people. And the people starts with society. People as in individuals, but much more involved in the term society. These are shared institutions that define behavior, what's acceptable, how to approach things. A lot of these are actually ingrained in culture and can lead to conflict and misunderstanding and divided societies when you have varying institutions. So the norms in one part of society are different than the norms in another part of society. Societies can involve various ethnic groups, each with its own set of institutions, various religious groups. So, for example, I remember in South Africa, the Afrikaners would look, they had this expectation that if you're telling the truth, you look straight into someone's eyes. The Zulus had this expectation that if you look into someone's eyes, you're challenging their authority. So this understanding was completely different. And the result was sort of perverse. You had, for example, the gardener who was accused of stealing something. And he denied it, of course, because he didn't do it. But he wouldn't look into the white accuser's eyes. And so therefore the whites assumed he was guilty. There are lots of things like this. If in some parts of the world, if you shake hands with your gloves on, it's rude. In other places, it's, why freeze your hands in order to say hello? So culture can be very meaningful. Culture is important in the policy world, and the U.S. military realized this in 2012 when they published an 18-page pamphlet officially titled Cultural Understanding, a Guide to Understanding Coalition Cultures. Of course, given the coalition of governments that were fighting in Afghanistan at the time. And this was introduced by the Afghan Defense Ministry. And what it was really an explanation of our troops to them, to the Afghans, since our troops weren't getting what was inappropriate and what was appropriate in Afghanistan. So here are a couple of excerpts. Quote, when coalition members get excited, they must show their excitement by patting one another on the back or the behind, it explains. They may even do this to you if they are proud of the job you've done. Once again, they don't mean to offend you. So if someone touches your butt, they're not trying to offend you, is what this says. When someone feels comfortable in your presence, another section reads, they may even put their feet on their own desk while speaking with you. They are by no means trying to offend you. They simply don't know or have forgotten the Afghan custom. And in much of the Muslim world, if you show someone the bottom of your shoes, that's offensive. Pointing to the soles of one's shoes is a grievous insult in Afghanistan. And so here you have Barack Obama, hanging out and talking on the phone. So cultures can have significance, enough that the military finally recognized this in 2012 and did something about it, or tried to do something about it. So let's start with the definition of political culture. Political culture is defined as the political psychology of a country or nation. It's about deep-seated, long-held values characteristic of a society or a group. It's not, I repeat, not about short-term attitudes and trends. It's not what the local public opinion poll says in the latest rendition. It's about long-standing values, things that tend to linger for a generation or two, at least, or longer, hundreds of years. Supposedly, it helps to explain why some societies are more prone towards one or another political option of the political options we discussed in the last class, of why some societies might accept military regimes or personalistic leaders, and other societies might only accept democracies. In other words, it's the basic norms for political activity in society. But political culture, is a very slippery concept. It's a guide to what's acceptable, broad guidelines for when and how to behave. Important elements include traditional versus secular rational culture, survival versus self-expression culture. So certain political cultures may be more prone to liberalism, communism, fascism, something else. And perhaps there's even a cultural prerequisite for democracy. So what do we mean by traditional political cultures? Traditional political cultures are those in societies that put more of an emphasis on religion, on family, on nation. There's a deference to authority figures, the patriarchal mold, for example. Secular rational cultures, by contrast, are much less deferential to authority. They're much more about individualism. Let every person say and believe what he or she thinks. Okay, not necessary to conform to the group around us. Which brings us to survival, which is a focus on group conformity. And usually it's a focus on group conformity in the name of economic and physical security. So again, what's the point of the state we discussed in the last class? Well, the point of the state is to provide us with security. And so survival political cultures are focused on security. And in order to achieve this security, the idea is that you need group conformity. You don't need someone walking away from the group and going off on their own, because that only weakens them and the group. The opposing culture here is self-expression. So it's a focus on the diversity of peoples and behavior. So the opposite of conforming, emphasizing diversity, celebrating diversity. So what you tend to find in the West are these secular and self-expression cultures. And then in various parts of the less developed world in particular, we talk about traditional and survival cultures. But this isn't necessarily linked to development per se, although there's actually a broad literature that says it is. But you can have developed countries where you still find traditional and survival political cultures. Okay, so again, certain political cultures may be more prone to communism or fascism, to these various political ideologies, than others. So let's talk about what we mean by these political ideologies. How do these cultures fit into the dominant political ideology? I'll take that in a separate set of slides. Oh no, I won't. We got 7:13. I'll keep going. So here's a rundown of these ideologies for you to consider. Liberalism has a focus on the individual. It's about individual political and economic freedom. The state under liberalism is a necessity, but it's a necessity that no one really wants. The less intervention, the better. The U.S. is probably the most liberal of the advanced democracies. Okay, the U.K. a bit less. The point here is it's free speech almost at any cost. Free market with almost minimal regulation. So if you compare the European countries, the advanced democracies in Europe, and the United States as an advanced democracy, you find that liberalism is much more celebrated or embraced in the United States. It's definitely not necessarily better or worse, but it's different. Okay, so you can say pretty much anything you want. You could say a whole slew of nasty things and get away with it in the United States. Whereas in parts of Europe, you could get imprisoned for saying certain things that are seen as a threat to social harmony. Okay, and again, the same with the market. Much more regulation in Europe than in the United States, for example. The next ideology we'll talk about is communism. In communism, you strive for economic equality for the entire group, for the entire community. This means you need high autonomy and high capacity. There's this belief that a small group is moving to dominate the state and use their wealth to control others in the sort of advanced democracies. So liberal democracy is really democracy for the rich, by the rich. And so we need a communist revolution. We need to bring about communism and subdue those individual liberties for the good of the whole. And then the result is true democracy. In communism, you would have true democracy because everyone would be equal. It wouldn't be a situation where you have to have several $1 million to run for the House of Representatives, for example. Everyone's equal. Moving down here, we've got social democracy. And social democracy, aka socialism, is a mix where you've got private ownership and market forces, but also strong state capacity and autonomy in order for the state to press for equality, greater degrees of equality than you would find under liberalism, significantly less than you would find under communism. And this social democracy is the guiding principle in Europe. It's the classic Western European template after World War II. where they're trying to increase social mobility of those further down and limit the mobility of those at the very top, so that there aren't these vast haves versus have-not differences. And again, go back to the way the state evolved in Europe, and that makes a lot of sense. Because why did you have increased focus on internal security? Because of the difference between haves and have-nots. So what's the best way to reduce social differences or social tensions? Well, the best way to reduce social tensions would be to create more equality, or I should say at least less inequality. Fascism, the fourth ideology up here, is a belief that certain groups are superior to others, and certain other groups are de facto inferior. It's a zero-sum game, right? Zero-sum meaning if there's plus one over here, there has to be minus one over here, so it ends up with zero. So some are better, some are worse. And there's a hierarchy of ethnic groups in particular. Fascism opposes individual freedoms. The collective will is the most important thing. The collective will of that majority or that superior group, which doesn't actually have to be the majority. The collective will of that superior group. Fascism is also anti-equality. Those deemed superior have to dominate. So it's unlike communism that it's anti-equality. It's also unlike liberalism in that it's anti-individual freedoms. In order to have a fascist state, you need high capacity and high autonomy, because the state has to direct this process, just like under communism. The fifth one here we've got is anarchism. For anarchism, you need individual freedom and equality. Inequality is the key problem in society, according to anarchists. But the state is not the answer. So communists are wrong by looking to a state to rebuild society. It's just another group with all this stuff. Whoever's in charge of the state is going to pursue a greater level of inequality. And in fact, when you look at the way communism developed in Eastern Europe, the former Soviet Union, in China, in Vietnam, in Cuba, wherever communism developed, you had a very small group of haves compared to everyone else, the have-nots, or the have-not-so-muches. So without the state, which reinforces inequality by supporting certain economic groups and concepts, society is going to be much more equal, relatively equal. People are going to be free to pursue their own lives. This is the idea of anarchy in anarchism. And finally, the last ideology here is fundamentalism. It's a relatively new ideology, an effort to reunite religion and the state. Faith as the authority and foundation of the modern regime. There are varying degrees of individual freedoms and focuses on inequality under fundamentalism. The whole point of fundamentalism is to bring religion and the state together. And often this does mean an attempt to get rid of significant amounts of inequality that can be found in societies, depending on the religious doctrine at hand. So we'll stop there, and I'll probably throw out a discussion question for you.